Okay, so some early theories of evolution. Remember, this fellow here was a creationist. So he believed in the concept of stasis. A rabbit is a rabbit is a rabbit. It does not change because of what the Bible said. Okay, creationism. Okay, and yet why do we put him under theories contributing to evolution? He acknowledged that the types of organisms in the fossil record changed over time. So he talked about a case of special creation. Okay, so he recognized things change over time. So the fossils, as we're going to find, is a key form of evidence. He attempted to explain this evidence with the belief in the theory of catastrophism. So a big catastrophe suddenly changed the fossil record. And for example, the dinosaurs all of a sudden died off 65 million years ago. Why was that? As we discover a huge meteorite hit of Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Okay, the next person, Thomas Malthus. He wrote this book right here, Essays on the Principle of Population, 1798. And his theory was actual populations. That means populations that have unlimited growth, not unlimited growth. Populations rather that are checked, okay, that don't have unlimited growth. Growth is kept in line by positive checks, which raise the death rate. So there's starvation, there's disease, and there's preventative checks, which lower the birth rate. For example, birth control, or postponing marriage, he said, okay? Now, the hypothesis then is actual population always has a tendency to push above the food supply, and that's going to result in competition. Now, as you'll see, this had a significant influence on Darwin, as did Cuvier's findings. Now, Lamarck is often credited with getting everything wrong. Well, did he believe in evolution? Absolutely, he did, okay? But the mechanism for it was incorrect. He also believed, which was popular at the time, of spontaneous generation, that you might remember from Science 10. New, very simple species of worlds will still arise by spontaneous generation, become more complex. So non-living things can become living things. That was spontaneous generation. Okay, so we want to take a look carefully at what his theory of evolution was. Remember, it's a theory of evolution, happens to be wrong. His theory is known as the inheritance of acquired characteristics, or the theory of use and disuse. How does he explain the giraffe's long neck? Originally, all giraffes had short necks. A stressing environment, so a selection pressure, for example, drought, causes resources available to the giraffe to be decreased. Giraffes driven by a desire adapted to the stress by stretching their necks to reach for leaves on higher branches. And then this trait was passed along, okay, to their children, okay? The law of use or disuse. If they kept using that neck, it got longer and longer and longer, okay? So here we go. Original short-necked ancestor keeps stretching its neck and stretching until it gets a really long neck, because the trees got taller because environmental conditions changed. Now, students will often use a Lamarckian term. They'll say that the organism adapted to its environment. And remember, I said that the definition of adaptation is very important. You look at that and don't get this wrong. This statement is wrong. The organism did not adapt to its environment. It didn't say, I'm going to keep stretching my neck, and then I'm going to pass this acquired characteristic on to my children. Okay, so this is where we enter into Darwin's theory, which is still used today, and that's why we teach it. Published the book Origin of Species by means of natural selection. We've already looked at artificial selection based on investigations of a 5-year voyage on the HMS Beagle. He studied finches in the Galapagos, and this is what he did, okay, 5 years. Went down to South America where he collected fossils and he brought them back to England. If he had just done that, Darwin would have been famous just for that, okay? Then after that, they went around and they stopped off at the Galapagos. He collected birds on the many different islands there, sent them back to England. After that, look where they went. They went to New Zealand, Sydney, Australia, down to Tasmania, over to some coral reefs, and eventually back home 5 years later, okay? So this was going to have a very huge impact on his life. It's a fascinating story of Darwin. When he came home, this was a period of social transition, and this idea that populations can naturally change was considered very problematic because of the French Revolution that just occurred in the previous century. And so people were nervous about social groups changing over time, lower class people overthrowing the upper class, that sort of thing. It also has led to, he was an atheist, and so this idea that humans shared common ancestors with, say, chimpanzees, our closest ancestor, our relative rather, so our nearest common ancestor with a chimpanzee was considered anti-church, right? Okay, so the term he used that we kind of want to look at is this concept of descent modification. Earth's many species are descendants of ancestral species that were different from the present day species. Based on the theory, approximately when did the most recent ancestor shared with the mammoth? So let's find the mammoth. Asian elephants and African elephants. So we can see that they share a common ancestor with African elephants here, different species, share a common ancestor with Asian elephants. Okay, that's where they share the most recent common ancestor, about 5.5 million years ago. And they have descended with modifications, okay? Modifications in their tusks, for example, okay, or their trunks. Those are modifications that have descended, but they share a common ancestor. Descent with modification. Okay, so let's go through the key points of this theory, okay? And it's also credited with a fellow by the name of Alfred Wallace, who came up with a theory at the same time. He sends a letter to Charles Darwin. It says, I've come up with this theory. And Darwin tells his friends, and his friends say, look, you came up with that theory as well. Publish your book. And Darwin said, I'm scared to publish my book because everyone's going to say that I think that humans evolved from monkeys, okay? And I don't want the negative publicity. And it was because of Wallace's letter that Darwin finally said, I'm going to publish my book. And Wallace said, you take the credit for it, Darwin. You're the big guy here. So it's pretty amazing. So we always give credit to Wallace as well. Okay, so the theory of evolution by natural selection. To survive in a particular environment, organisms must possess traits that favor their survival in that environment, possess variations that become adaptations to their environment. Theory of evolution proposed that natural selection and isolation that could occur account for how living organisms become adapted to their surroundings. Natural selection depends on the following criteria: variation, selection pressures, and competition. Survival of organisms with favorable traits, survival of the fittest. And by fittest, we don't mean can run the long distance race the best, but happens to have variations suited to a changing environment. And reproduce and pass those on. Variation must be inherited. Now, this is going to give eventually rise to new species, okay? If the population becomes isolated. We're going to talk about speciation later on. Individuals that have variations, favorable, that allow them to survive, change, will reproduce and pass on the characteristics to the next generation. Individuals are no longer able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring, become new species. We'll talk again about speciation a bit later on. Okay, so let's take a look again at these main points. Oh, look, here's a population of Homo sapiens. All capable of interbreeding, therefore they're the same species. But look at the variation. So that's one of the main principles. Each generation produces more offspring than can survive. Obviously, he was influenced by Malthus here. And that's going to lead to competition. Look at the little runt. Where's the runt? Okay, we'll pick on this one right here. That's the runt of the litter. And if it doesn't have the variations of strength to be able to get to the mother's milk, it will die. There's competition for limited resources. Competition for limited resources. So there's a struggle for existence. In this case, light. Those that can grow tallest survive. Those that have the deepest roots for water will survive. And then those that have those variations, nature selects individuals with more favorable variations are more likely to survive and thrive. So theory of evolution by natural selection, successful individuals will reproduce more, passing favorable traits on to succeeding generations. And over time, we get larger changes in populations. So let's look at the giraffe again. What would Darwin have said? Originally, most giraffes had short necks, but some variation existed. As food supply and lower branches dwindled, short-necked giraffes did not survive. Long-necked giraffes did survive. Survival of the fittest, only giraffes that survived could pass on the trait. Longer-necked giraffes are better suited to their environment, therefore more likely to survive and reproduce. Natural selection. Over a long period of time, the population of giraffe changed from mostly short-necked giraffes to mostly long-necked giraffes. Okay, we get a change in population. Okay, in the frequency of their what we call alleles, various forms of different forms of the same gene. Okay,